Hi everybody, my name is Daniel. I'm here with Chris, and we're here to talk to you about our vision for Detroit in 2050. So to start off, I want to give you a brief overview of the city today. Detroit is a medium-sized city in Michigan, USA, and I would define it as the 1950s dream of an American city. Why? It relies on fossil fuels, it relies on cars, and it relies on manufacturing and trade for its industries. Everybody in the 1950s would have loved to live here. But this mindset of being stuck in the 1950s poses a problem. In fact, they're very unsustainable, Detroit. And this is evident in a Siemens report that came out about 2011, 2012, which ranked Detroit as 27th out of 27 North American cities based on sustainability. So that shows you that it's unsustainable. And a major reason why for that is their electricity grid. 69% of all electricity produced in Michigan or Detroit is from fossil fuel sources, leading to an emissions factor of 890 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour produced. And this is a huge number. Why? The U.S. national average is 744 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, so about 20% higher than the U.S. average. And this high emissions factor leads to high emissions, evidently. In 2017 alone, there was 10.2 million tons of CO2 emitted in the city. 93% of it came from the transportation sector and the building and facility sector. Why? Those sectors rely mainly on fossil fuels. Transportation for gasoline and diesel, and buildings, they have natural gas for heating, and 70% electricity is from fossil fuels. So almost 93% of emissions all is because of fossil fuel use. So before I go into what our goal is for the city, I just wanted to show what the urban metabolism was in 2017. Honestly, there's nothing remarkable about it. Everything is input equals output waste. The only exception is they do have an unremarkable recycling program that only 2% of households are part of, and they do incinerate some of the waste for energy. So what is our goal? Unfortunately, most of you guys, well, fortunately for you guys, I should say, you each had a city with a plan in place saying what the city wanted to be, what it wanted to do in the next 20, 30 years. Detroit has absolutely nothing. I don't know why, but we were just got lucky like that. So what we did was we kind of looked at different reports by third parties. One of them was Detroit's electricity and natural gas utility company, DTE. They had a report in place that stated they wanted to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050. So we thought we could probably match that, give or take. So our goal is to reduce emissions by a total of 70% from 2017 baseline levels. And we believe this will be accomplished by not only rehabilitating the electricity grid, but by also doing 4 types of developments. Developing denser neighborhoods, developing more green initiatives for buildings, developing an urban forest, and developing more rapid transit in the city. So to start off, I'm going to start with the building initiatives that we've had in place. We came up with 6 main initiatives, which fall into 3 different categories. And overall, we believe that these initiatives will reduce emissions by 1.2 million tons of CO2 in the residential sector alone. So the first category is non-invasive measures. So anything that they have nothing to do with construction. The first one is something that we do have in Ontario already, which is to ban all incandescent light bulbs from being sold in the city and only allowing LED lights to be sold. This is because incandescent light bulbs are something like 98% inefficient in producing light, while LED lights are about 80 to 90% efficient. So that's a huge gain from lost energy. The second non-invasive measure is to require all single-use family houses or single-family homes to plant 3 trees each. Why? Trees beautify the neighborhood while also sequestering the CO2 and reducing cooling needs, because they produce shade and they have evaporative processes which reduce cooling needs. Second category, retrofits. We want to get all the old single-family homes to have updated insulation. We want them to have R19 insulation in the basements and R60 insulation in the attics. Why? We found out this will reduce heating needs in conventional Detroit homes by 40%. Other retrofit that we want to do is require all homes to have a 200-watt 200-watt solar panel installed for each resident. This is because it will reduce the need on the electrical grid, which is dirty, and also save people money. Last category is new construction. We want all new multi-story residential buildings to have a green roof installed. I'm not going to get into the details. I'm going to beat a dead horse. We've heard it many times when green roofs are so good. The last initiative for buildings is we want all new single-family homes that are going to be built from now to 2050 to be built as passive homes. It's expected that 50,000 homes are going to be built from now until then, and we want passive homes because passive homes are airtight, We have efficient ventilation systems that reduce the energy need for heating and cooling by 90%. Now to transportation. Our main goal for transportation is to reduce the need for private automobile use. And we want to do this through two main ways: increasing the active modes of transportation, and again, as I mentioned previously, developing a rapid transportation system in the city. And you'll understand why we want to do these two things once I talk about what the current transportation system is in place in Detroit today. So in terms of biking, there's currently 400 miles of bike paths in the city, which isn't bad. It's pretty good, honestly. But the problem is that there's many gaps in the system. So a lot of paths are not connected to each other. And in addition, safety is an issue. In 2016 alone, there's 177 crashes with bicyclists, and there was 38 deaths. So we want to reduce this. And how are we going to do this? Well, first, we're going to reduce the gap by introducing bike lanes on all these yellow paths. These are where all the gaps are identified by the regional governments. And to help with safety, we're going to have separated bike lanes, as can be seen in this diagram. In terms of public transit today, this is what the bus system looks like. And to the naked eye, it looks pretty good. Bus routes are about 1 mile apart from each other, and it covers most of the city. The problem arises from the headways of buses. The headway for buses is about 20 to 40 minutes during peak hours. Nobody's going to use transit if you got to wait almost half an hour to take a bus. And in terms of rapid transit, they do have a streetcar line, which is very poor with headways of 25 minutes, and it's called the Q line. And they also have the Detroit People Mover, which is just a unidirectional monorail. But however, we're not considering it sort of as a transit system because it's basically a tourist trap. So what are we going to do to increase transportation in the city? Well, we're going to have 4 new LRT lines introduced in the city and expanding the Q line to reach Detroit's borders. We're also going to create 6 new BRT lines. We want to be able to connect people from their homes to the commercial centers or to the industrial centers. We want people to not take the car when they need to go to work or want to see a movie or want to go to dinner. And in order to connect people to these new lines, we're going to have to increase the frequency or the headway of bus service on all major routes to 10 minutes. So this is just a map of where we propose to have our LRT and BRT system. As you can see, it covers quite a bit of the city, so almost anybody should be able to reach a line within 10 minutes of a bus ride. And this is just an example of a possible LRT street configuration. If it's on a bike corridor, there's going to be bike paths. And this is an example of a BRT street configuration. So this transportation initiative is going to actually reduce VKTs by about 30% and reduce the mode share of car by 17%, which is going to be made up by transit and active mode of transportation. I'm going to turn it over to Chris now.
So thank you, Dan. So I'm going to be talking about the land use of Detroit. So Detroit as a city it has sprawled a bit, so we want to promote the mixed-use dense communities throughout the city with an emphasis on green and blue spaces. So this is what Detroit's land use currently looks like. On the left, everything's spread out. The yellow is low-density residential communities. The green is the parks, and it's not too gray right now. So we want to. This is our proposed land use solution. The yellow is low density. The orange is mixed density, and the red is high density residential areas. The green is the park space, with the purple being the industrial sectors. So currently, we want to lower the residential, commercial, industrial land use percentages while adding them to parks and open spaces in order to have a little bit more of a green city going forward and promote active transportation measures. So neighborhoods in Detroit in the future will be designed with BRTs and LRTs in mind, as well as active transportation methods. We want stops to be around 800 meters from all residents, so it's accessible for people who want to use it. Also, the implementation of mixed-use housing in communities will allow for people to have choices in what the residents want to live in, as well as being closer to public spaces, transit, and other amenities. We want to zone commercial, industrial, and office spaces within residential areas to promote the mixed-use development in the high density of the city, and we want to emphasize the green and blue spaces that are used. So this is an intersection in Detroit today. As you can see, a lot of empty space, low, small buildings, and this is an example of the same intersection that we proposed in 2050. As you can see, there is dedicated lanes for transit. There's more green space with the additional added density. You can see there's a bunch of different kinds of buildings, so that's the mixed-use portion of it. Again, this is a subdivision, an example of a subdivision in Detroit today. Not too much greenery, very, very dense housing, and this is what we want to do, more mixed use, much larger green spaces that can link parts of the subdivision with active transport, and just looks a lot more vibrant. And this is the proposed land use mix for neighborhoods that we want to use in Detroit. So in Detroit, as Cubes mentioned, they use a lot of fossil fuels right now, and our goal is to transition most of this to nuclear and phase out coal almost completely. We want to implement natural gas a bit more and have focus on natural sources of energy such as wind, solar, and hydro. Under our vision, our emissions from energy production will be reduced by around 90%. So Detroit currently has quite a few water, stormwater, and wastewater issues. They have, since they have such old housing, they have very old plumbing fixtures. So if we were to upgrade those, they could result in around 30% savings in water consumption. They have a problem with piping insulation, so if they need more energy to heat water up. So if we were to add more insulated piping, our water consumption all over Detroit will be reduced by approximately 25%. Detroit also has a very aging water infrastructure for their water distribution. They lose approximately 42 billion of water that is unaccounted every year due to leakage in poor infrastructure. So our plan involves replacing a bunch of this, as well as retiring water mains in less dense areas of the city in order to increase pressure and lower maintenance costs across the whole system. As you can see, our vision drops the water substantially in terms of consumption and stormwater usage. So one thing Detroit is pretty good on right now is implementing green stormwater infrastructure. So they have a lot of urban farms, rain gardens, and permeable pavements that are used to alleviate the stress on the combined sewers in Detroit to minimize the amount of sewer overflows. So we agree with Detroit's plan, and we want to go forward with it, and we want to decrease and with this, our plan hopes to decrease the stormwater numbers by around 30%. So, as Q mentioned, there's pretty poor waste management in Detroit. There's no mandatory curbside recycling program, and there's very few composting. There's little composting done in the city. So we want to lower the amount of waste that is sent to landfills and that is incinerated, and we want to increase the amount that's wasted and composted by implementing a mandatory curbside program while emphasizing and incentivizing the composting. So this is what our urban metabolism will look like after. I'm sure the numbers are a little bit hard to read, but it's pretty much just the updated numbers. So this is our greenhouse gas emission comparison. There are substantial decreases in residential, industrial, and transportation sectors, with a slight increase in the commercial and institutional emissions. Overall, our number does increase a bit by 2050 in terms of gross emissions. However, if you look at it in capita, it lowers by about 3 tons of CO2 emissions per capita. So I picked 3 sustainable development goals that are probably most pertinent to our Detroit. So the first one is 11.2, which has to do with the safe, accessible transport systems throughout the city. So our neighborhood design is planned with transit in mind, and with our vision, our transit will potentially increase by around 20%. So, and all the transit will be designed with accessibility in mind. And the next target that is applicable to Detroit would be the due to disasters, losses due to disasters such as water-related disasters. Everyone knows about Flint, which is near Detroit. So even in places like in the United States of America that are developed, there can be real serious water-related disasters. So our plan involves replacing the infrastructure, as I mentioned, which would hopefully reduce leakages and minimize the potential for contaminants getting into the distribution system, which will allow for a more efficient system. And finally, the third goal would be to reduce the environmental impact per capita in these cities. So, as I mentioned, Detroit has a very poor system, and under our vision, they will implement implement a mandatory recycling system, which will definitely increase its recycled waste. Under our vision, it'll go from 7 tons in 2017 to around 38 tons in 2050. Additionally, using the incinerator less will reduce the amount of particle matter. And in conclusion, even though the gross increases, per capita tonnage of CO2 emissions will decrease, and hopefully using our practices, Detroit will become a more sustainable city going forward. Thank you very much.